and I'm going to be talking to you today about sensory processing disorder. I will be defining the disorder for you, and then we'll talk a little bit about diagnostics and treatment for adults with the disorder. So before I go on, can I just see a show of hands of anybody who already knows what sensory processing disorder is? Okay, so a few of you, which is good. And for the rest of us, we'll be learning a little bit of something. So, sensory processing disorder is a condition in which the brain has trouble receiving and responding to information coming in through the senses. So I'm going to give you a little refresher course on the 5 senses. We have sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And the 5 senses have the responsibility of collecting information from the world around us, sending that information to the brain to interpret. So, for a neurologically normal person, the brain acts like a filter. It takes in sensory information from the world around it, it looks at the task at hand, and then it decides what's necessary to the task at hand, and it only allows that information to come through the filter. Now, for somebody with sensory processing disorder, the filter is essentially broken. And what that means is all this sensory information that's coming through is leaking through the filter and bombarding the person, leaving them feeling totally overwhelmed. So, for the visual people out there, what does sensory processing disorder look like? It looks a lot like this. So now for somebody with sensory processing disorder, obviously they're being constantly bombarded with sensory information without a filter, and it's going to leave that person feeling really overwhelmed. So why is a literature major standing here talking to you about sensory processing disorder? I have SPD. So 2.5 years ago, like a lot of you, I had never heard of sensory processing disorder. But what I did know is that I was very anxious all the time, and I always have been. And it's also really easy for me to get distracted. But about 7 years ago, I was diagnosed with general anxiety disorder by a psychologist. And what I do is when I'm feeling particularly overwhelmed, I'll revisit him, and he'll give me some coping mechanisms that I can apply to my life. I'll apply them, and I'll feel marginally better. Not fantastic, but well enough to go on with my life. But what happened 2.5 years ago was my second child was born. And when she was born, I found myself extremely overwhelmed. And so I did what I had done. I went back to my therapist, and again, we revisited some of those coping mechanisms. I applied them to my life, and it just wasn't working. And so I found myself really frustrated, and I did what we all do when we have a problem that we don't have the answer to. I visited Dr. Google, and I found this sensory processing disorder. And like I said, I had never heard of it before, but there was a survey that you could take online, and hopefully this is here. It is. You don't have to read all that. It's just kind of to show you that this is a lot of stuff that I checked off yes to. So again, I took this survey to determine whether or not I had it, and I pretty much hit all the markers for sensory processing disorder. Now this is an online survey, and we all know that that's not science. So I took this back to my psychotherapist, and I showed it to him, and he did a couple of surprising things. First thing he did was he sat back in his chair, and he just looked at me. And he looked at me for a long time with this perplexing look on his face, and I was a little freaked out, to be honest with you. But he finally spoke up, and he said, "Anna, I cannot believe that we've missed this all these years." And then he said, "I'm really sorry, but I can't treat you anymore." He said, "You're going to have to find an occupational therapist who specializes in sensory integration therapy for adults." And he said, "I hate to tell you this, but you're going to have a really hard time finding that therapy. There are a few practitioners out there who specialize in adults, but they're few and far between, and I don't think that there are any of them in Michigan." So I thought, no, this can't be true. So I took this information to my general practitioner and talked to her about what we had decided. And she said, "Yeah, you know, sensory processing disorder, it's definitely a thing. It's out there, but children are usually the only ones that are treated for it. And frankly, we don't really know how effective the treatment is anyway, so why don't you just take the sedative medication and be on your way?" And I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't going to work for me. I have 2 small children, I have a husband, I have a house, I'm in school, I have homework, I have to drive. I want to fix this. I don't want to take a medication. So I started doing my own research. And this is what I found. 15 to 30% of adults are thought to have sensory processing disorder. It ranges mean, it's on the spectrum, and it ranges between mild and severe. And most people who have sensory processing disorder, and I say most because it's almost 100%, also deal with anxiety and depression. And the reason for that is, number one, if you're constantly being bombarded by sensory input without a filter, the world is going to feel like a scary and overwhelming place. And with depression, people who have sensory processing disorder who are left untreated, they develop their own coping mechanism, which is basically sensory avoidance. And sensory avoidance means avoidance of life. And if you're avoiding life, you're going to be depressed. Now, despite what my physician said, sensory integration therapy has been empirically proven to improve the lives of people with sensory processing disorder. Not just children, but adults as well. However, most occupational therapists don't treat adults, and there are a couple of reasons why they don't. Number one, sensory processing disorder is a relatively new diagnosis. It was discovered in the 1960s by a woman named Jean Ayers. There was somebody before her, but she kind of brought it to the forefront. And back then it was considered to be a childhood illness. And recently, the field has caught up, and they know that it's a lifelong disorder, but practitioners just haven't caught up with the field. So, Teresa May Benson, who is a leading researcher in the field of sensory processing disorder and sensory integration therapy, was quoted as saying, "Adults with SPD are increasingly seeking sensory integration-based occupational therapy services and frequently report that they are not able to locate practitioners who are willing to treat them." Now, as far as I'm concerned, this is a problem. If 15 to 30% of people have this disorder, and those people are also afflicted with depression and anxiety as a result of this disorder, and there's a therapy model that has been empirically proven to resolve this disorder for people, I'm here to advocate for occupational therapists to include adults in the treatment of sensory processing disorder.
Questions?
Did your studies show any comorbidity with sensory processing disorder with similar things such as ADD or HSM?
Yes, it's actually comorbid with a lot of things. So it's comorbid specifically with autism and spectrum disorders, ADHD, and several other psychological disorders.
Can you clarify more about why occupational therapists refuse treatment for adults beyond the newness of the diagnosis? Is there something blocking their adoption of the empirical models that actually work?
Sure. So sensory integration therapy for children is very different from sensory integration therapy for adults. Sensory integration therapy for children is play-based. So when you walk into a facility that offers this for children, it's going to look like a gymnasium. So there's going to be a lot of fun toys and like balls that they can bounce on and shaving cream to play with. And this is very different than the therapy that they would offer to adults. So for adults, you get an assessment, they determine whether or not you have it, and then they decide what you need. And it's usually home-based. They kind of give you things that you can do, like listening devices and things that you would do throughout your day, and then they monitor you. And so it's just very different from the therapy that they would offer to children.
If it's mostly home-based, then it's something that can be done remotely.
Yes, definitely. It could, but there isn't a lot of research out there, and there isn't a lot of availability of resources for people who are seeking this thing. So there are a few researchers out there who kind of know what to do for people, but it's not really accessible. So, yeah.
Beyond your own research, have you ever received treatment for SPD?
No. So I'm still here trying to find it. There's a place in Colorado that offers it, but it's in Colorado, and I have 2 small children, so maybe one day when they're in high school and they don't want me around anymore.
And one last question, will have to be a short answer too. What was the drug that this therapist wanted to prescribe?
Xanax.
Oh,
Sorry.
Okay, I've been there, done that. Okay, I think that we'll move on to the next speaker then, but I have one more round of applause.